Today's headlines: quantitative easing destroying private pensions, but what about the 4 trillion elephant in the room? The end of the euro draws near after the Greek elections, and the Queen sets out the next stage in the coalition's dismantling of the nation. Hello, it's Thursday the 10th of May. I am Malcolm Massey, and welcome to the UK Column News. Figures from the Pension Protection Fund show that Britain's private pensions are now in deficit to the tune of £216 billion, having risen from £10.6 billion in the past month alone as the effects of quantitative easing continue to be felt. Quantitative easing is the Bank of England's policy of buying back government debt from investors using money hot off the printing presses. The resulting increase in demand for government bonds increases their cost, and the returns available to pension funds falls correspondingly. This is a disaster for pension funds who need to pay money out to their members each month. The collapse in bond yields has caused a corresponding increase in the amount of assets they need to hold in order to provide the returns they need to cover these outgoings. The PPF figures show that in the last 12 months, pension funds have seen the deficit between the assets needed and the assets owned widen from £8 billion to over £200 billion today. It should be noted that while the deficit in private pension provision is extremely serious, it is far insignificant compared to the funding deficit in the public sector and state pension pots, currently standing at over £2 trillion each. To clarify, during the Blair and Brown years, the government effectively stole money out of the pensions of future generations by spending it, leaving public sector pensions and state pensions unfunded. Today, an estimated 40,000 public sector workers will strike over proposed changes to the terms and conditions of their pensions. Speaking about the reasons for today's strike, PCS General Secretary said, "Confirmation that the government intends to plough on with unpopular, unnecessary and unfair cuts to public sector pensions is disappointing but not unexpected. Ministers have consistently refused to negotiate with us over the key issues of forcing public servants to pay more and work longer for less in retirement, and that is why hundreds of thousands of them will be on strike." The question is, why are the unions hiding the truth from their memberships about the reasons for the cuts to public sector pensions? Following on last week's speech by Mervyn King at the Today programme lecture, where he made it clear that the Bank of England have no solutions to the ongoing financial collapse, Bank of England Head of Financial Stability, Sir John Grieve, has said that bank regulators must tone down attacks on the banks in order to help the recovery. Grieve suggested that strict oversight of the banks is making recovery more difficult. At the Monetary Policy Forum meeting yesterday, he said, "Pressure on liquidity and capital, plus continued debate on what is an allowable bank model, is pushing them to deleverage more than they might be forced to anyway. I think this is an area where the US managed, by being rather overgenerous on an objective basis, to get their banks out of crisis mode and back into lending mode more than we have. I would be seeing if there were any things we could do that would be more effective than denouncing them for continuing to pay dividends and bonuses, which is a perfectly valid point, but in macroeconomics the job is to get the aggregates to move." This sentiment needs to be taken in the context of Mervyn King's speech last week, where he lamented the removal of responsibility for banking regulation from the Bank of England in 1998, to be given to the Financial Services Authority. King was looking forward to that responsibility returning to the Bank of England because he said it would enable the bank to take away the punch bowl before the party started. Grieve's comments seem to imply that the bank is more likely to tip a few extra bottles of vodka in first. The election of Francois Hollande to the presidency in France, and particularly the failure to elect any government in Greece, has sent shockwaves through the financial system. So far, the FTSE has lost over 3% this week, with similar or larger falls in the US and other European stock markets. Of even more concern is that Spanish bonds are back over the 6% threshold, which makes it unsustainable for governments to borrow. But it's not only the markets that are suffering the shockwaves of recent election results. Angela Merkel finds herself almost alone in Europe as France, and especially Greece, build momentum against further austerity and Greece says that they will tear up the EU-IMF Troika bailout deal, which is imposing such drastic austerity. The Greek threat to reject the Troika has resulted in the usual threats right back at Greece from the banks. The usual rhetoric of full default and banking crash and European Monetary Union expulsion, to which the Greek says, yeah, and? Yesterday, Panos Kaminos, the leader of the Independent Greeks Party, called for a Europe of the nations rather than a Europe of the banks. We are the anti-memorandum front. The fight to liberate the country is above all else, he said. The situation in Greece is quite dangerous for the financial system because without a functioning government there is no one to make decisions on a series of bond repayments, decisions which cannot wait until new elections. The elections in France and Greece have thrown a whole new dynamic into the financial collapse. The concern for the markets has to be that no matter which party or parties in Greece manage to form a new government, the new government's first task will be to abandon the EU's demands for Greece to commit suicide. In Britain, on the other hand, it's full steam ahead for David Cameron's austerity programme. The Eurozone remains in extreme trouble and is in recession. Oil prices are making life difficult for families around the world. At home, we inherited an economy built on the sands of debt. We can't burden our children with the costs of paying today's bills tomorrow, Cameron said on Tuesday. There is no danger of burdening our children with the cost of today's bills tomorrow. David Cameron's austerity programme is doing such damage to the NHS that it is unlikely there will be very many children left to pay today's bills tomorrow. So Cameron clearly feels he must pay off today's bills as quickly as possible. Staying with David Cameron, he and Nick Clegg attempted to reinvigorate their relationship this week, having been trounced in the local elections. It was not just the election results which have them on edge, however. New research from Nottingham University has shown that the coalition government has experienced the highest levels of opposition from their own MPs since the Second World War. MPs have defied the whips in 44% of parliamentary votes since the general election, which is the worst of the insurrection coming from MPs elected for the first time in 2010. The British Retail Consortium continued to promote its delusions yesterday by issuing a press release blaming the wet April weather for the fall in retail sales. Like-for-like sales fell by 3.3% compared to the same period last year. This is at a time when retailers are cutting margins to the bone in an effort to keep sale levels high, sacrificing profit in a vain effort to keep stock levels turning over. BRC Director General Stephen Robinson said, "The wettest April since records began has put a dampener on retailers' fortunes. We would beg to differ. Financial collapse and joblessness have put a dampener on retailers' fortunes, not the weather." War with Iran looks more likely this week as Benjamin Netanyahu announced a partnership with the Kadima opposition party on Tuesday night. The deal increases Netanyahu's majority in the Knesset to the point where his room for manoeuvre on issues such as Iran, Palestine and the growing fractiousness between religious and secular Jews in Israel. Kadima leader Shaul Mofaz has been made Deputy Prime Minister. The deal has come about because his ruling coalition was so utterly divided that he could get no traction on many issues. Netanyahu had stated publicly that he would call a general election in September, a year early. But in fact, he was doing backroom deals to form a new coalition which now comprises 94 of the 100 Knesset members. In the meantime, pressure is building for a NATO intervention in Syria, as the armed opposition finally sets aside any notion that they are a generally peaceful opposition simply responding to government violence. Russia has made it absolutely clear that it will step in if NATO intervenes in Syria, but it is the activation of the European anti-ballistic missile system which is being seen by Russia as a direct threat to its sovereignty. Last week, General Nikolai Makarov, Russia's most senior military commander, warned NATO that if it continues with the activation of the missile defense system, Russia would consider a preemptive strike against it. The deployment of new strike weapons in Russia's south and northwest, including of Iskander systems in Kaliningrad, is one of our possible options for destroying the system's European infrastructure, he said. Aside from the usual anti-Putin rhetoric from Western politicians, It is the response from NATO which is more concerning. At a press briefing held yesterday on the upcoming NATO conference, NATO spokesperson Oana Lungescu evaded the Russian question by saying, "I haven't seen the statement from General Makarov today." She said that NATO's system is neither designed nor directed against Russia. We have no intention to attack Russia, and we hope that NATO has no intention of attacking us, because that is the spirit of the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 15 years ago and of the Lisbon Summit in 2010. That's not quite how Russia sees it. The Queen gave her speech to Parliament yesterday, setting out the next stage in the coalition's dismantling of the nation. As expected, reform of the House of Lords was on the list. This bill is being hailed as a power to the people type of legislation, but nothing could be further from the truth, as this bill will allow the speakers of both houses to select a private committee that would elect part of the House of Lords. The vast majority will be elected by a public vote, similar to the House of Commons, resulting in party politics in both parliamentary chambers. The clear intention is to remove blocks to the passage of government legislation in yet another clear anti-constitutional decimation of the separation of powers. Also featured in the speech was the government's banking reform bill, which has largely been misrepresented as Glass-Steagall-type legislation, though nothing could be further from the truth. Rather than the legislative requirement to split retail and investment departments into completely separate businesses, the proposed legislation creates a firewall, a notional separation of functions within what remains a single corporation. The government claims this will protect the retail arm from the actions of the investment arm, but of course, in practice, it will be impossible to regulate and police. The Children and Families Bill would appear on the face of it to be an improvement, offering more flexibility for fathers with better options for paternity leave and ensuring improved access for divorced fathers. However, one key ingredient of the proposals is the speeding up of the adoption process. The main reason for this seems to be the need to reduce the cost of holding children in care. However, with the corruption within social services, the family courts, and particularly the so-called expert witness system, the dangers of miscarriage of justice increase massively as a result of this bill. The Queen also announced the government's intention to snoop on our private calls and emails, along with establishing a national crime agency, Britain's FBI. The National Crime Agency will be the subject of a future report. Laughably, the government is planning to introduce an electoral registration and administration bill, creating an individual voter registration to cut down fraud. The present registration scheme is a household one. Will this stop fraud? Unlikely. Instead, we would suggest that the purpose of this legislation is to further the profiling of our population, so that the ministers can tell who votes for whom and, over time, identify the swing voters. A sign of changing times, since, at one point, the public vote was considered his private choice, like so many of our liberties that have already been legislated against. In the US last month, a judge ruled that jury nullification, a juror's ability to overrule the law, was still lawful and very much in effect. This is following a case in which 80-year-old Julia Heiklin was arrested by FBI agents for passing out pamphlets which informed jurors of their right to nullify a case if they thought the law being applied was unfit or unjust. The prosecution had accused Mr. Heiklin, who was handing out the pamphlets for an organisation known as the Fully Informed Jury Association, of trying to influence jurors through written communication. However, in a victory for justice, US District Court Judge Kimber Wood disagreed with the prosecution, emphasising that, though it is unlawful for jurors to be told how to decide a specific case, jurors can be informed of nullification. Jury nullification, a legal concept that dates back to 17th century England, remains perfectly lawful in both the UK and the US, and can be used by any jury which believes that the law is not fit for purpose in a specific case. The concept of jury nullification is that juries should be able to not only decide whether a defendant violated the law, but whether the law itself is just and proper. It is a constitutional doctrine that allows for the acquittal of defendants who are technically guilty of a crime, but who the jury does not feel should be punished for their actions, because the law itself is unjust. Jury nullification highlights the fact that, though we may feel constrained by over-oppressive laws and legislation, we, as the individual, still have the capacity to override the law using the common sense that we all have. Serving on a jury is something people are often afraid of. It should be seen as a right we should fight for at all costs. The government has once again refused to publish the official assessment of the risks involved in the government's NHS shake-up, contrary to law. Andrew Lansley, the Health Secretary, said in his statement, "This is not a step I have taken lightly. I am a firm believer in greater transparency, and this government and this department have done far more than our predecessors in publishing information about the performance and results of our policies. But there also needs to be a safe space where officials are able to give ministers full and frank advice in developing policies and programmes." This government is sliding increasingly towards a secretly controlled state where elites and their servants are able to make decisions behind closed doors without the public knowing. The government's laughable admission that it is the most transparent government ever is shocking. This government uses a show and tell tactic, show us everything but tell us nothing, which is best illustrated by their poor attempt to disclose government expenses, which was deliberately broadened to hide the details. If there are risks involved in NHS reform, civil servants are duty-bound to tell the public. However, the most shocking aspect of all this is the blatant disregard for the rule of law. The government has already lost 2 legal battles in which they have been ordered to publish the risks. Commenting on this, Lansley said, "The choice to use the veto rather than appeal the decision to publish the risk register was made because the Secretary of State and the Cabinet views this as an exceptional case where there is a fundamental disagreement on where the public interest lies in relation to the disclosure of the risk register. Surely, if there is such a disagreement, the only course of action would be to publish the risks and move for a referendum. That would be the democratic approach. That the government has not done this shows that they are neither democratic, constitutional, or even lawful. Using a veto, the government has simply highlighted the fact that they have no standing in law." The Shadow Health Secretary, Andy Burnham, condemned the decision by accusing the Cabinet of showing a flagrant disregard for the law of the land. He said, "David Cameron is desperate to keep the NHS risk register secret because he knows that if people could see the scale of the risks he is taking with the NHS, they would not forgive him. This disgraceful decision is a cover-up of epic proportions." And finally, a reminder of the upcoming Financial Terrorism Exposed talks, which will take place in Dublin on the 27th of May, Manchester on the 2nd of June, and London on the 3rd of June. The aim of the talks is to encourage those that are still largely unaware of the dangers that face them and the lies that they are being told by the mainstream media and governments to stand up and take interest. So please do encourage as many people along who are still unaware of these issues. Speakers include Ian R. Crane, Brian Gerrish, Thomas Sheridan, William Engdahl, and guest speaker John Perkins, the author of the well-known publication Economic Hitman. The inimitable Max Kaiser, along with Stacey Herbert, will be speaking at the Dublin event, which takes place a week or so before the Irish referendum. And Alessio Rustani, the man who famously said on the BBC last September that the world is not run by governments, the world is run by Goldman Sachs, will speak at the London event. Details are at economichitman.co.uk. We look forward to seeing you there. I'm Malcolm Massey, and this has been the UK Column News. Thank you for watching.